During the 16-bit generation, one of the things I loved was the fact that you saw some developers make completely different versions of the same IP. I'm not talking about differences in graphics and sound here, or an extra stage or weapon, but entirely different games top to bottom. That motivated me to search out some games on the Super Nintendo that were very different than the stuff you played on other 16-bit consoles. Sometimes the results weren't quite as nice, but sometimes they gave us another version that was just as playable or even better. I've got 10 games for you, so let's get started. I'm sure most of you remember The Adventures of Batman and Robin, developed by Clockwork Tortoise for the Sega Genesis. It was a 1995 release that saw the original cartoon turned into a run-and-gun with a really steep learning curve. It was graphically incredible with special effects you didn't typically see on the Genesis. Sega was in control of the license at this point, and it saw further development on the Sega CD and Game Gear. Over on the Super Nintendo, Konami was the license holder and internally developed their own version of the game, also called The Adventures of Batman and Robin. Their game was released at the end of 1994 and took on elements more akin to a hybrid side-scrolling platformer and beat-em-up. They also added gadgets that could be used at various times to complement the action, basically allowing you a measure of exploration and troubleshooting beyond just kicking enemies' asses. The visuals are absolutely gorgeous here, with animation, art, and color use that falls in line with the cartoon on which it's based. There are also a fair bit of nice special effects, such as rotation and transparencies at work. The music is also well done, capturing that Danny Elfman style that was so prevalent in the 1990s. Once you get used to how it plays, just negotiating the stage obstacles becomes a blast. You have your grappling hook, you can grab ledges, and you can wall jump, all of which will be put to good use thanks to the large stages and their many thematic layouts. It couldn't be more different than Sega's take on the IP, and well worth playing in its own right. (1993) was the year that Aladdin made its way to the 16-bit platforms. Sega and Virgin worked together on the Genesis edition, releasing an action platformer that was one of the best-selling games on that hardware. It was animated extremely well thanks to Virgin working directly with Disney animators, and really nailed the look of the film. Over on the Super Nintendo, it was Capcom that had the license and the duties to develop their own version of the IP. While they did go a similar route with an action platformer, it is a starkly different experience in look and feel. First, Capcom's effort is not nearly as well animated and avoids any type of sword play. Instead, it focuses on attack mechanics that have you jumping on enemies' heads Mario style. A simple description like that may lead you to believe the Sega game is radically superior, but hold on. The Capcom game is loaded with outstanding stage design that keeps you busy. Our main hero is quite the acrobat and can jump, flip, grab, and glide all over the place. This feels fantastic and elevates the experience well past the otherwise mundane attack mechanics. Don't let the animation get you down either, because the graphics are very well done in other areas. There's some great layering to the backgrounds, tons of transparencies, and some nice effects on some of the later boss encounters. I guess what I'm saying is that the narrative over the years is that Sega had a version that just dogged out the competition. I'm not so sure that's the case, because Capcom's game is still well made and very much worth your time. In 1994, Konami had their work cut out for them. They were the sole owners of the Animaniacs IP for the Genesis and Super Nintendo, which would make you believe they would just develop one game and port it between the two. Nope. Old Konami was a beast back then and went on to program two very different games. The Genesis edition was sort of a puzzle platformer, where you needed the special abilities of all three characters to get through the stages. It wasn't so different from something like the Lost Vikings in that regard. The Super Nintendo version goes for a completely straightforward action title instead. Here your job is to collect pages of a movie script, defeat bosses, and traverse the sets of various movies. In this version, our trio of heroes have no real discernible skills that separate them, and they each basically act as health points or lives. If all three are defeated or caught by the security guard, it's game over. I genuinely applaud the Super Nintendo version for its presentation, but it isn't what I'd call an outstanding game. It's incredibly shallow and there's little in the way of satisfaction because the gameplay offers so little variety. Having all three heroes on the screen at once is also distracting as hell, and leads to taking easy damage far too often. It isn't that it's terrible, far from it, it just isn't up to Konami's usual standard of excellence at the time. The Genesis edition fares better with deeper mechanics, more to do, and more satisfying objectives. This is one case where I feel the Genesis release is the one to play. Batman Returns was a huge film release in 1992, a sequel to the epic Tim Burton original. Sega had the rights to do the versions for their consoles, and they teamed up with Malibu Interactive to release an action platformer based on the IP for the Genesis. As before, it was Konami that held the license for the Super Nintendo release, and they went in a completely different direction, with a side-scrolling beat-em-up similar to Final Fight. If you know my channel, then you know my feelings here. The Super Nintendo version of this IP pisses all over the Genesis release, top to bottom. It looks better, it sounds better, it plays better, and not by a small margin. When I played these two games, I immediately lamented the fact that Sega had control of this license and produced the inferior version. I would have much rather Konami port the Super Nintendo game in some form to the Genesis, even if they moved things around like they did with Hyperstone Heist. I know there are those of you out there that enjoyed the Genesis game, but I wasn't one of them. I found the stage design and combat to be so off-putting, whereas the Super Nintendo version was spot on in every area. Sega would redeem themselves by rebuilding the Sega CD version around driving stages, and giving the Game Gear and Master System a very decent release all its own. But there's no other way to say this. The Super Nintendo game outclasses them all. With our next game, I decided to throw you a curveball and cover a game that started life on the PC Engine Super CD-ROM. Dracula X Chino Rondo was an exclusive addition to the Castlevania franchise by Konami, released in 1993. It follows Richter Belmont in his quest to stop Dracula, a stunning adventure that made use of thrilling cinematics, incredible CD-quality music, and tried-and-true gameplay that never felt better. It was a pivotal creation in this universe because much of its art and characters would go on to be used in numerous sequels in the following years. It was so well received that Konami would decide to remake the game for the Super Nintendo in 1995. Known as Demon's Castle Dracula XX in Japan, Castlevania Dracula X in North America, and Castlevania Vampire's Kiss in PAL regions, this is at first glance a very similar game. The heroes, enemies, and gameplay resemble the PC Engine original quite closely, with the biggest changes occurring with the story and stage design. Here it deviates quite a bit, and though it still looks and plays the part, the Super Nintendo version doesn't reach the same level of excellence. In the plus column, it does have multiple endings, and I absolutely love that soundtrack. Though I feel Rondo is the clear winner in overall quality, I think this one gets a bit of an unfair critique. It's often labeled crap or a bad Castlevania entry, and I feel it deserves a lot better than that. Just because the PC Engine got a better game in the series does not mean this one should be punished for not being the same product. In 1993, Santos teamed up with Taito to bring the Genesis a game based on the Flintstones cartoon series. It's a pretty standard platformer that uses hearts for hit points, stars to collect for extra bonuses, and it has a number of vehicle stages. This version of the game was not ported to the Super Nintendo in any form, and remains a Genesis exclusive. It was quite an odd license for a Japanese studio to develop and publish. It must have had a very limited release in Japan, because a complete in-box edition these days is quite expensive. In 1995, Ocean Software released the Flintstones on the Super Nintendo, a licensed game based on a live-action film. Of course, with different developers and based on a movie, this is nothing like the Genesis game at all, outside of the two being platformers. I wouldn't call it terrible, but it's also something I wouldn't recommend very highly unless you have big love for the IP in general. The controls are stiff and the physics are heavy and often unresponsive. It's quite irritating to play after long periods, in fact. Now here's where things get really interesting. This Super Nintendo game did have a Genesis port, though it was never released on a physical cartridge. Ocean Software had plans to bring it to North America and Europe, but it never materialized. Instead, it ended up a Sega Channel exclusive that has largely been lost to time and circumstance. All we currently have now is a prototype of that Sega Channel release, which does appear to be nearly identical to the Super Nintendo counterpart. So the story goes like this. The Genesis received a Flintstones game based on the cartoon series in 1993. The Super Nintendo got a Flintstones game based on the live-action movie in 1995. The Genesis got a port of that, but it was Sega Channel only. Quite the history for a franchise that was already over 30 years old at that point. In 1995, a developer called Vivid Image did Street Racer for the Mega Drive. It was a 4-player kart racer with some very decent visuals and a solid soundtrack. It has a comical cast of racers you could choose from and special items to help you stay ahead of the competition. As you can see from the footage, the graphical style is very similar to other racing games of the time. Unfortunately, it did not make its way to North America or Japan, and instead stayed in PAL regions and Brazil. The Super Nintendo edition preceded it by about 6 months, and was released in both North America and Europe. This version takes on a completely different look by following in the steps of Super Mario Kart. The tracks are much smaller and slower in feel and presentation, especially with the twists and turns right on top of one another. From there, much of the cast and track themes are similar to the Genesis version, right down to their color use and art style. Which one of these you find more appealing is likely down to preference of your racing style. If you enjoyed the small, twisty Super Mario Kart tracks, the Super Nintendo version is going to hold a similar feel and fun factor. The Mega Drive game opens the world up a bit and feels much more like a long-distance racer, akin to something like Super Hang-On, albeit with a comical theme. It's pretty amazing how a hardware feature like Mode 7 can take development in an entirely different direction like this. It isn't hard to find games between the platforms that exhibit this, but Old Street Racer here may be one of the most prominent examples of it. If you are a fan of the Genesis, chances are you remember 1994's Robocop vs. Terminator by Virgin Games. It was a gritty run-and-gun platformer loosely based on the original Frank Miller comic series that was done in 1992. I really enjoyed it for a number of reasons. The two movies it's based on had some incredible characters, the premise was fascinating, and the dark and moody gameplay was fast, challenging, and violent as hell. The Super Nintendo version actually beat the Genesis game to market by about 3 months, and was developed by Interplay. While it too is based on the comic book, it took a number of different paths than its Sega counterpart. The two share little in regards to stage and art design. They have similar locations, but the Super Nintendo version is cleaner, lacks blood, and features wildly different animations, pretty much across everything. The gameplay also feels different, right down to the speed of movement, the way the weapons feel, and how the enemies attack you. I want to be clear, the Super Nintendo version is not a bad game at all. It's actually quite well done itself, with some pretty nifty story panels that explain what's going on, and a Mode 7 sequence as you make your way to the final Skynet CPU battle. I just find the Genesis game edges it out in looks and gameplay. That last part especially. The enemies in the Sega version feel like they are placed better, and give you a fair shot at avoiding cheap damage. I feel the late game of the Super Nintendo edition goes out of its way to put you in situations like that far too often. Still, overall I find both of these very much worth playing despite their differences, and recommend you take both trips. In late 1994, Konami released Sparkster, a sequel to their fantastic Rocket Knight Adventures game. Once again, the land of Zephyrus is under attack and only Sparkster can save it. Though there are a number of tweaks, the gameplay remains quite similar to the first. You use your rocket pack to blast all over the stages to defeat enemies and collect helpful items. I thought the first game was one of the best looking Genesis titles at the time of its release, but I felt Sparkster wasn't nearly as impressive overall. I'm not saying it looked bad, it just didn't have the same level of art design and color use for me. What's more important was the gameplay, and that was just as fun as ever. Unfortunately, the Super Nintendo never received a port of the original Rocket Knight Adventures, but it did get a game of Sparkster all its own around the same time as the Genesis release. Konami also did this one, but had a different team design and develop it, so it bears very little resemblance to the Genesis adventure outside of the main hero. It also feels like this one is the first sequel to the Genesis original, and the Genesis Sparkster is a sequel to the Super Nintendo game. The core gameplay around boosting remains largely the same, but the Super Nintendo version includes the sword throw from the original. Moving from one to the other is still fairly easy, however, and both these games are very much worth playing. I feel you can analyze the details for personal preference, but at the end of the day, the Genesis and Super Nintendo Sparksters are both well-designed action titles that hold up well. It's a real shame we never got a proper sequel for it on the Saturn or PlayStation. Tasmania was a cartoon series in the early 1990s starring everyone's favorite Tasmanian Devil. Sega would pick up the license for its consoles and release a Sega Genesis version in 1992. Recreational Brainware handled the development duties for what was a very popular action platformer. I wasn't a fan of the sound and music in this one, but the visuals aren't terrible at all. The sprites are large and expressive, and there is a nice amount of variety in the stages and backgrounds. It's tough to believe this shipped on only 4 megabits of ROM. When this launched on the Super Nintendo, I was expecting a platformer done in a similar mold, but the developers at Visual Concepts went in another direction entirely. Tasmania on the Super Nintendo was a forward-scrolling action game that locks you on a single path. Hell, it's almost a 16-bit demake of the Crash Bandicoot games. Sadly, the graphics on display belies the painfully simple gameplay beneath it. The entire premise of the game is based on Taz catching a certain amount of kiwi, or small birds, to finish the level. Outside of avoiding obstacles and eating stuff, that's all you really do. This is fun for a few levels, but it gets quite repetitive quickly. The difficulty is entirely about how many kiwi you have to catch before the timer runs out. I don't know, I really expected better from publisher Sunsoft. For what it's worth, I do applaud the courage to take the game in a completely different direction than what you saw of most licensed games at the time. There's very little like it on the Super Nintendo, and that might make it worth playing for many of you. The funny thing is that most of the games I covered here also have very different versions on other platforms. It's easy to go back to a game like Batman Returns and find a completely different experience for the NES, and yet another completely different game for the Master System and Game Gear. By the time you add in computer variations, it wasn't difficult to find 4 or 5 different games available for any given IP. This made the 8 and 16-bit era sorta special. Instead of the mass of carbon copy multi-platform releases you see today, there was genuine variety back then. That variety wasn't always outstanding, but it did give you plenty to discover when you experience new hardware. If you guys like this episode, we can certainly do more. While I covered some big hitters here, I by no means exhausted the available games that would fit into this category. If you'd like to see something specifically, let me know down in the comments, and I'll see what I can do. I'm Sega X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.